Hello, today we're speaking with Frederik Taarnhøj at FaunaPhotonics. Welcome to podcast, Frederik.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. So to start with, could you tell us a little bit about FaunaPhotonics?
Yeah, so FaunaPhotonics is a Danish tech startup. It started up in 2014. So we've been around for around 7 years. We're about 30 people now, and we primarily work in the ag and the environmental space.
And what drove that initial decision to start FaunaPhotonics?
Well, it's a long story. It's actually a bit of a funny story. When I was in my early 20s, I did various stints at larger companies. I studied an MBA degree when I was also mid to late 20s at MIT in the US. I got the entrepreneurial bug there. Yeah, I was married before the MBA, so as part of the MBA and after the MBA, I had a lot of kids, needed to make some money. So I worked for a larger company again just after the MBA. But actually at the MBA, I met this really interesting scientist, engineer, do-it-yourself type of guy from Sweden at a conference that I participated in. And he had a bunch of prototypes, early prototypes that he had worked on and was continuing to work on. And I just had this desire in trying to start up something entirely new and actually use the connection to him to develop new ideas for various types of hardware startups. Through another connection, I met a biologist, and turned out he also knew this prototype developer, engineer. And together we sort of developed this idea of working with one of his prototypes was focused on insect detection techniques. And that sort of was the beginning of the venture. And that was around 2014.
Fascinating. And from there, what was the kind of next steps on that kind of journey?
Well, the next step was that I needed to quit my job. I was actually on father leave. I just had twin boys at the time, and I was on father leave for about 4 months and had salary during that time. And I was kind of bored in my old job, and I had this opportunity with this biologist and this idea, this early prototype of insect detection, and I simply jumped on the opportunity. So I quit my job, and then I set up shop. I incorporated an entity and started working with no pay on that new idea.
And so, that's obviously a big kind of jump, right? You had the backstop of a few months of paternity leave, but that's probably a very stressful time to kind of take the risk of taking that jump. I suppose, what was the kind of thought process at that time?
Well, it wasn't a big thing for me in the moment. I don't know. This engineer was really talented, and he was convinced that with this technique we could actually start distinguishing between insect species. And the biologist was convinced that there was a biological relevance of this new technique. And I was so convinced that I could do it with this great education from MIT. And having seen various other teams have success, so I was sort of pretty confident that we could do it. Perhaps I was a little bit overconfident.
Sure.
If I had been more risk averse, I would probably not have started the company. I would just stay my own job.
And from there, you had a kind of basic kind of concept of a prototype. What do those kind of early users? What did that first 6 months look like as you tried to kind of both de-risk certain aspects of the company and find some traction?
Well, the early days were quite slow. Initially, the biologists and this engineer were researchers, so they were in their research positions at 2 different universities. So in fact, it was only one person doing the startup in the beginning. That lasted for about 2.5 years, whereas I was sort of searching for the killer application for this insect detection device. And actually, we had a portfolio of hardware technologies that we started out working with. We had an idea for a bird detection device as well, and then we had some aquatic activities as well. So we had sort of a portfolio of 3 applications that I iterated on, and it turned out that the agriculture application for this insect technology was was the hottest and the most hyped. In fact, during those first 2.5 years, we were approached by the chemical industry, the pesticide industry that was actually actively seeking for next generation insect detection technologies. And actually, I didn't do much marketing other than I built a pretty cheap website. One of my friends did it for like $1,000, and then we explained the purpose of the technology, the capabilities of the technology, and somehow some tech scouts at these chemical players picked up on it and flew to Copenhagen. And from there, we were able to build up first sort of R&D collaboration with the ag industry.
And so the kind of basic, if you will, funding came from that early relationship, or were you taking in kind of outside capital at this point as well?
I was taking in anything I could get.
Sure.
My own money, grants, money from family and friends and fools, this usual suspects.
Right.
In the early stages, local business angels. We're also able to get some revenue in the early days by doing some bee monitoring and consultancy work from local research groups that were looking to map out pollinators in landscapes. We could do something there with an early device, so we're able to make some revenue on that. So whatever we could get and whatever we could scrape together.
And what were some of those use cases that you ended up kind of discarding and not going down the road of?
Well, quite early on, because we had, this relationship to the chemical industry, they were pretty clear on where they sort of had weaknesses and strengths and where they were looking strategically to develop something new. And it was during those days that these chemical companies were building up their own software departments and, to do digital recommendations to farmers. So they were sort of deeply involved in trying to specify what was going to be part of their development pipeline. And they were actually able to specify for us what crops and what insects we should be working on would have the highest relevance. So that was actually a pro for us, because in the early days we primarily had scientific and technical staff and didn't know much about agronomy and biology. So having this relation to experts and specialists early on was a real plus.
So one of the kind of frequent tensions when you have kind of small, nimble startups working with much larger companies is this kind of contrast in speed. The small startup can do, an awful lot in a couple of days, whereas sometimes it might take 2 months just to get approval at these larger companies. How did you find that relationship in terms of those different kind of levels of speed?
Well, I think the collaboration with the specialists and experts was really fruitful, and we had some really good workshops, and they were able to sort of help us on this product requirements journey for the next generation's sensor technology. That really assisted us coming up with a sensor that could actually work in a real life scenario. But we could also sense that the companies were big,
Sure.
One part, of course, we didn't have a lot of money, and they had lots of money, but it was tough negotiation getting them to, for example, prepay some amounts. We're actually very close to not being able to pay salary 1 month to our team, but we're able to convince this larger player to give us a prepayment for the R&D collaboration, and that sort of saved the company during 1 month. So, yeah.
Like incredibly stressful moments.
It's pretty stressful. I don't know. I don't know if I didn't tell anyone, so it was. I guess it was mostly stressful for me. I had a few sleepless nights that month.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine. He runs a security startup in Silicon Valley, and he was down to 6 weeks salary for 15 people at one point before he raised his next round. And basically, he's on the phone, 12 hours a day, just trying to get enough cash to kind of cover, that shortfall. And like those are tough moments, especially if you're trying to raise money, because things like valuation can suffer because you're coming from a position of weakness. But at least if you're working with a client, it doesn't really affect valuation, doesn't really affect dilution. You're just prepaying specific milestones and so on.
Yeah, and you have to be careful it doesn't affect your mood and your ability to be productive at work. So you get a little bit Teflon coated when you've done this for a while. You don't want to show to the technical team that they might not get salary, but just sort of power through the tough moment and try to survive.
And from there, getting into something that's like a commercialized application, what is, I suppose, today a typical deployment of the sensor look like?
Well, we actually have deployed quite a number of sensors now. In the past 2.5 years, things have gone pretty quickly. We built our team out from around 8 to 15 people to now 25 to 30 people and growing to 35 people over the course of 2021. And initially, we sort of worked with one sensor prototype at a time, trying to iterate on the optical concept and the accuracy of the device and the data analysis, the experiments going along with that. Moving into making several of these devices, and now having our own sort of assembly and production and able to produce multiple sensors. So when we start the spring season 2021, FaunaPhotonics will have produced 125 sensors, and these will be going out to various types of collaborations, partnerships, PUC tests and field tests across the world, both in Denmark, but also in various places in Europe and in the US and maybe also South America.
And what are the kind of specific use cases for this kind of deployment? Are these kind of farms pretty similar, or there's a fair amount of difference between them?
Well, right now the sensors go out primarily in partnerships. So this is with the larger companies, the chemical companies and equipment manufacturers of the world that have some specific development needs and things that they like to work on and see as part of their long-term strategy in their companies. But typically, it's two applications that we're developing sensor technology for. It's the when to spray or intervene in your plant breeding, and it's the where. We've actually been able to take the stationary sensor technology concept into a mobile setting where we've placed these sensors on intelligent sprayers and are able to also say something about where the insects are in the field. So it's these two, when to spray and where to spray, really.
And are you kind of targeting the insects, let's quote unquote, that are, eating the plants that we're trying to get rid of due to the pesticide? Or are you also looking at insects that you want to protect that are the beneficial insects and you're trying to avoid those insects?
We're also looking at insects more broadly. We're developing a sort of a biodiversity, insect biodiversity indexing methodology. We have various partners for that. A good example is General Mills in the US, where we are working to map out insect biodiversity in their regenerative farming initiative, as part of the regenerative farming initiative. So, but it's the when is the pest arriving in your field? When should you most optimally go and intervene and spray for that? But it's also giving the whole sector deeper understanding of effects on beneficial insects and pollinators of various types of farm management.
And what are the main advantages to having, more insect biodiversity? I mean, it sounds great, just, without not knowing too much about it, but, what are the kind of, how does it affect the food supply? How does it affect an individual farm and so on?
Well, it depends on the crop, but there are certain crops where you can actually, if you're really, really careful and you're really, really diligent as a farmer, you can actually avoid having to use chemicals. If you set up your landscape in the right way, you set up your crop rotation in the right way, and you by the way, haven't overused chemicals, you can have the right balance between pests and beneficials that you don't need to intervene. So that's sort of the dream scenario where the ecosystem is in perfect balance. pollinators, everybody knows the pollinators are important. Well, it's just sort of the world cannot run without the pollinators. So this is definitely something that should be taken care of. And what we can do with our technology is actually to provide data points on that. And something that's not been monitored because it's really not something that the farmer has been able to buy inputs for. You produce your plant and you try to protect it from predators and buy inputs to protect it so you can get a higher yield. But you can also get a higher yield of the pollinator. And getting data on this will perhaps provide new opportunities to manage farms and manage landscapes.
So, for example, if you had two farms alongside each other, one has an amazing set of biodiversity with a large number of pollinators, and the other maybe less so, and the inputs in both farms are basically the same in terms of fertilizer and so on. The kind of more biodiverse, higher pollinator quotient farm might have a higher yield, and that basically can indicate the types of practices the lower yield farm could potentially implement to greater attract that biodiversity.
Exactly. And I think General Mills' regenerative farming effort is a good example of trying to reestablish landscapes as they used to be with lots of thriving biodiversity and ecosystems that are in balance, because this is really the most efficient way to get a good and stable yield, and also not just the yield, but also the quality of the plant and the taste and so the characteristics of the plants are highly dependent on this balance in the ecosystem. If I were a farmer, I would definitely choose to be the diligent farmer who's taken very, very good care of the land, been a good steward of the biosphere, of that landscape that I'm taking care of. This is not something you can change from year to year. This is something it's longer term and requires a skill set and diligence that's perhaps not the norm.
And what is it like, you're working obviously with these large channel partners. Is there any plans to kind of work directly with farmers as well? Or like from a go-to-market, it makes more sense to work with the large chemical and agribusinesses?
Yes, we do work with the farmers directly. This is the real plus of starting an agtech company in Denmark. Denmark is a quite small country with 5.5 million people, but we're actually some of the best in the world at food production and have some of the most innovative farmers and most environmentally friendly farmers and environmentally friendly practices. So Danish farmers are diligent. If you can provide value to a Danish farmer, we usually say you can provide value to every farmer in the world, because these are really, really talented and tough customers that are tweaking every little part of their farm. And it's a plus for us. Our company is based in the capital in Copenhagen, downtown almost, but it's only a quick drive down to a local farm, and we can test and improve on both our hardware and software in close collaboration with these test farmers. So they are happy to participate.
That's amazing. And, I've talked to a few different companies who are deploying different types of sensors. There's a podcast coming out in a couple of weeks with somebody who built a sensor to detect the ripeness of fruit, to prevent spoilage events. I've talked to a lot of people who are working on sensors in, soil carbon sequestration and similar. So there seems to be this kind of very, exciting ecosystem of ag tech sensors kind of emerging. In your mind, like why now for all those sensors? Is there something that changed in the availability of simple parts, or some different type of skill set that's emerged to kind of explain the amount of sensors that are kind of coming out now?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask, but from what I've seen myself, my short lifespan, I just turned 40 today, so I'm not that young anymore.
Well, congrats!
It's my birthday. Yeah, well, I think that we've had a period with a lot of hardware focus, and then we had sort of a long period with software and internet hype. But I think maybe we're back to the hardware deep tech again. It's not even called high tech anymore. It's called deep tech, and I think there are a lot of other things that are happening. What we're seeing is that Well, we could actually quite easily couple this new optical design towards enabling it by making it cloud connected. Well, that's really fantastic, but actually quite cheap to get started with a lot of different players in the cloud space, and actually then quite easily being able to couple our data in the cloud to various types of web interfaces and app interfaces, and suddenly you have this deep tech from a Swedish university that's been sort of developing in a research setting for maybe 20, 30 years, and then being able to connect that to the world and sharing the data that this new type of biophotonics device can create. So I think there are a lot of drivers, but it's definitely a good time in history to be starting this type of hardware company.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the prices of even things like desktop 3D printers, and I haven't looked at those prices in a while, and they were in the thousands. And then you can get a decent one for $300 or €250, and I mean that. Just if you're a kind of a young student, you just want to kind of play around, you can make a mold, buy a couple off-the-shelf sensors, and then just get something out into a field maybe in a week. And again, it all depends on the specific use case. But on that kind of data, there's a lot of these companies, again, kind of collecting data. You have other things like satellite imagery data. You have data coming from, the sprayers and the tractors and all this kind of thing. And so you now have farms being this incredibly data-rich environment. How are farmers or the companies that serve farmers making sense of this data, combining it in a way that's like most actionable? Because in other industries, we've had problems where companies individuals start to drown in the data, and it's very hard to actually make actionable decisions on the basis of it.
Well, I think understanding how actionable your data actually is, I think the best way to do that is to test with farmers early on, directly with the farmer, to understand is this a data point that they can actually tie an action to, and can they do that easily? Getting the data to them in the right business model and through the right partner, or maybe on your own, is a little bit of a different discussion. But I think for us to scale our business, we've considered basically two routes, and we've built capabilities for both routes. One route is to go direct to the farmer with our own app and web interface and sensor, self-direct. And another route is, of course, to team up with some of these digital platforms that are already out there and have thousands of registered users. We think the last point is, or the last avenue route, is providing some quite interesting possibilities for maybe startups that are a little bit more hardware focused. With 30 people, we have various skill sets, but we don't have a lot of registered users on a platform yet. There are multiple partners that do have a digital platform with thousands of registered users and users that are pretty good customers, that are these diligent farmers working on precision ag and using precision ag in their operations and making money on it, and therefore also having the ability to take on new technologies into their farming operation.
And, you mentioned kind of what your kind of goals for the next few months. It's kind of more deployment, more usage. Looking out at kind of 2 to 3 years, what are the kind of company's goals in that kind of time horizon?
Well, we've just been through a pretty comprehensive strategy process. We had a bit of a board reshuffle, and the new board has come together and with the management devised a new strategy for the company, a 3-year strategy. And in that strategy, we have pretty ambitious commercial goals and a strategy of we call it a partnership strategy. Teaming up with the right partners to scale up our activities and get these sensors into the hands of the farmers.
And is there kind of a geographic kind of element to that? You mentioned, you're obviously European based. You have some kind of penetration in the US. Is that kind of the kind of balance you're going to maintain kind of going forward, or?
Well, this is worldwide. It might also include Asia. So it's US, South America, Europe, and it might also include Asia. And hopefully, this technology that we've developed and invested into will become the new standard in digitizing insect data globally. That's what we're working towards.
Amazing. And I believe you raised some outside capital seed round in the last kind of 12 months. What was that process like? In the early days, as you mentioned, there was a lot of, just trying to grab anything you could. But now it sounds like, it's like the idea is being recognized by outside investors. And so how did those meetings go in your overall process for raising that capital?
Well, we've had ups and downs, definitely. Things have developed sometimes positively, sometimes in another direction. But investors have been there all along to support us. We've been able to raise funding from primarily private investors and have been able to broaden our private investor base. Most of the private investors are based in Denmark, but we actually also have a good private investor connection in the US that's really supported us in getting to the next step. So these are part of our family, and we wouldn't have a company without these people. So if we haven't thanked them already, here's a broadcasted big thank you.
Absolutely. And, it's a question I feel we always have to kind of ask, like, how has COVID affected you and the company over the last, going on nearly a year now?
Well, it seems that agriculture is continuing. Plants are
people need to eat.
Yeah, plants are being produced. There's more space between people out in the ag landscape, so I guess they can continue driving in their tractors and doing their everyday thing to get the food produced and get that out to people across the world. So it seems a little bit unaffected. Of course, we've had less travel activity and much more digital activity. We have people working at home. The production unit in FaunaPhotonics was, of course, not able to work home. We did experience some COVID infection in that part, but they are recovering and they're all fine. And the company is all fine.
And in terms of, let's say, just thinking about like Denmark as a place to build startups, could you speak to the startup ecosystem in Denmark, and what are ways that the ecosystem could be improved on?
Well, I think it's a really strong ecosystem. There's a lot of smart risk taking going on. We've probably had some decades and some years and some risk taking that wasn't smart, but that initial risk taking in the ecosystem has developed a lot of intelligence in the ecosystem. I think it's in the space that we're in. I think we have a bit of a sweet spot because we have a quite strong photonics stronghold. So there's a very strong ecosystem around hardware development, optics, sensor devices, lots of really, really good consultants to help this hardware development process. In machine learning and AI, things are also getting stronger. And since we're a small country, it's quite usual to look outside of the country borders for talent and for opportunities. So I think a lot of people here know from the get-go that they need to get on a plane and to create some opportunities for themselves and the country. So I think we have a lot of strengths. And specifically in food and agtech, I would take a closer look, and if you like, I can provide context to other really interesting startups in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I think I'll send those separately if that's what you're.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so some of the benefits of kind of localized startup scenes is that they do focus, right? So I think about Barcelona, which has a particular kind of consumer mobile focus, and then you have other kind of places which are trying to kind of, replicate what you do and what Silicon Valley has achieved, and they try to be a little bit of everything to all. And so you're saying that like agtech and kind of similar is kind of Denmark's focus, or are there other areas of strength in Denmark?
I think in the high-tech space, we're very strong on life science and biotech. Food is probably a little bit stronger than the agtech part, but there's a lot happening in agtech, and it's becoming, I would say, more balanced between the food and the ag. There's some animal tech as well. And then, of course, there's lots of other sectors that I don't have knowledge of or interested in that are strong in Denmark. I think if you look more broadly, one thing that we don't have these mega venture capital funds that, to really rapidly drive things forward. Our VC community is quite strong, but it's not the Silicon Valley or New York area. We have some bigger funds, or the Boston area for that matter.
And what are your views on kind of other kind of technologies in ag tech space, and how they intersect with kind of what you're working on? And so I'm thinking about kind of more exotic technologies like cellular meat or vertical and urban farming. How do you think about the emergence of those kind of technologies that are potentially incredibly disruptive to the entire agricultural system?
I don't know. I'm kind of old-fashioned. I like a good steak, but my family, my wife, and my kids are starting to buy these fake meats in the supermarket, and they're creeping into our everyday life. I don't know, it tastes okay, and things are happening there that are of course interesting and might also have an impact on the climate and so on in the long term. I think it's good for the plant breeder because more plants will be needed in these products. I guess they're happy. Vertical farming is quite cool. We actually have one of the biggest vertical farms in Northern Europe. It's called Nordic Harvest. They just raised a major investment of building out their facilities. So we are up on the beat, I would say, in Denmark, and we're part of the cutting edge in all fields. Perhaps not on the plant-based meat part, but in other fields we are on the beat.
Yeah, this was one thing I never had considered before this conversation around things like vertical farming is, where is the, I suppose, biodiversity? Are they letting the insects in, or are they doing kind of some form of manual or industrialized pollination within these large vertical farms?
Well, I think that perhaps they produce things that don't need pollination. I guess it's things like rucola, salad and the like. I'm not sure how broad of a vegetable or fruit production they can handle in the vertical farms. I guess remains to be seen. What sort of ecosystem environments they can create indoors, that's what I'm saying.
Makes sense. And I was just thinking about, let's say, that next generation of potential founders or people working at early stage startups. If you were kind of speaking to that next generation, is there any particular advice you give to those people?
If you want to start a company in ag tech?
Or in general, in the kind of ag tech, clean tech space?
You need to be a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, I think. I actually think the initial stages of the company formation were more interesting than now. Now it's about, we have to have systems in place, reporting in place, we have to this and that, HR procedures and so on and so forth. There's a lot of legal stuff and all these slightly more boring things. That just part of creating a company and growing a company is start to take up your time. But in the startup phase, I think you need to like risk. You need to be a bit of an adrenaline junkie. If you're married and have kids, I used to say thank you to my wife because I knew that I was probably more difficult to hang around than a PhD student.
Right.
Always thinking about the company, always talking about it, and she got sick and tired of hearing about it. But we're still married, so that's good.
That's good. No, absolutely. This is one of the things I think a lot about, and that I've experienced in previous startups, is making sure that like startups at different stages are attracting the right kind of people, because you do need those adrenaline junkies who will just take full ownership and not ask for permission. Those first kind of 10 employees, like any bureaucracy is like a startup killer. But then once you get to 50 or 100 employees, you have to be less risk taking because now there's actually a company there, right? And there's 100 people who need to eat and all that kind of thing. And so now you need systems so that you don't break the entire product with through one person's, playing around with something. And I think, a lot of companies that I've been involved in that kind of the stage you're at right now, in that 15 to 40 person, you have a lot of turnover because, I'm personally not the kind of person who loves the 50 person or plus company. I love that early stage. And so, did you find that? Did people kind of start to kind of look and say, hey, this is actually getting a little bit too bureaucratic for us?
There's sort of a natural evolution. I think in the initial stages, it was very much getting the experimental prototypes developed further, and the people we were able to attract there were some really, really smart guys and girls. Like they sort of came from hard tech, deep tech, and primarily from the academic environment, actually. And it turns out that this type of talent is actually used to something that's very, very similar to the early stages of the startup life cycle. Having to apply for grants to even have, 1 year of postdoc work ahead of you. So they were used to having these short deadlines, having to overachieve, having a very, very short runway before the money runs out, and this curiosity and stifled by big corporate environments or big development departments, a stringent way of working. Very, very curious people. So I think that was a real plus that we were able to attract that type of talent in the beginning.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of insight into, a certain approach of academia, because it's definitely a perspective about, like you get your tenure and then you're kind of working on projects and there's no real deadlines. But absolutely, that kind of generation who doesn't have that job security in academia are very hungry, and may have these shorter time horizons. I think that's very well said.
But James, you also have to be a little bit careful, because it depends on the talent again that you get in, but you have to have sort of a customer that you're developing for, and this is something I've seen in some ecosystems and in other companies, and partly also in our own company, that you want to watch out that you're not just creating a research team, because research continues forever. You have to have something that balances this research talent and some commercial focus, and that sort of change happened for us when we were sort of at the 8 to 10 people size. We were able to attract some really, really ambitious, commercially focused people who were able to take the early prototypes we had at the time and say, okay, how do we make this into the product? How do we get this tested at a larger scale? How do we attract some more capital into the further development, and also bring software into it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That balance is absolutely key. Well, Frederik, this has been great. Is there anything I should have asked you about before we finish up here, but did not?
I've been thinking about that. What's your favorite insect?
What's my favorite insect? That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the obvious answer is bees, but yeah, I'll probably go with that. I grew up in Ireland, and the diversity of our insects is pretty low. So, sorry, that's not true. There's incredible diversity of insects, but they're house flies, and there's a half dozen. There's nothing too exotic, and so yeah, I suppose one of the aspects, as you asked me that question, it's I'm not just paying attention to it. And I suppose it's a good lesson for everybody listening to actually think about that. And, it's by far the most common animal that we come into contact with every day is an insect, and we're probably not noticing it like I don't either.
Yeah, it's a really important part of our world, and we need to take very, very good care of these creatures.
And what are your plans for your birthday this evening?
Spending time with my family. I've been away from them traveling, not the past 6 months, but before that. So it was going home and spending time with my family and celebrating. We can't invite anybody anyway because there are these COVID-19 restrictions, which is kind of an act. I was looking forward to a party, but that'll come.
That'll come. Well, happy birthday, and thank you very much, Frederik.
Thank you very much, James.